Thank you, Burke, and thank you to you and to Patricia Taylor for organizing this symposium this afternoon. It's great to be here and to talk about the important issue of global change in our iconic protected areas. Now, I was unsure of who the audience would be today, so how many of you are studying or working here at this university in ecology or related fields? Most of you. All right. Well, if there are some of you who are not, I have tried to scrap the technical terms and the complex graphs from my presentation, so hopefully it will be easy to follow. So the first question you may have is, what is an iconic protected area? This is Lady Elliot Island, the southern end of Australia's Great Barrier Reef. And Australia's Great Barrier Reef is an example of an iconic protected area. It's famous, known worldwide, and it attracts visitors from around the world who come to experience its natural wonders. The state of Wyoming has its own iconic protected areas. For example, Yellowstone National Park, I've known about since I was probably 6 years old. It's globally renowned and it attracts visitors from around the world. Now, I've said that iconic protected areas are under threat from global change. What is global change? Global change includes climate change. Now, we all know a lot about climate change. We hear about it all the time. It gets a lot of media coverage. Politicians talk about it. But global change also includes other important drivers of change that do not get nearly as much attention. And these include invasive species. In Australia at the moment, there's actually a big extinction taking place in the Northern Territory, in Kakadu National Park, one of our premier national parks there. And most scientists, or many scientists, think it's to do with the cane toad and to do with other invasive species. And those pressures from invasive species obviously interact with climate change, and that's part of the process of global change. Land use change is another important driver within global change. Bill Lawrence and his colleagues recently published a paper in the prestigious journal Nature, where they showed that the condition of protected areas in tropical forests around the world depend to a large extent on what's going on with the land use around those areas. So even though the forests are intact within the protected area, if there's clearing taking place outside of the protected area, outside of the fence, that affects what's happening to the state of nature and to biodiversity in that protected area. And again, you have interactions with climate change. Now, global change isn't only about environmental change. It's also to do with socioeconomic change. And socioeconomic change includes elements like rapid economic growth in emerging economies and rapid growth in consumption, globalization, more people are moving around the world more, the world's more interdependent, and importantly, growing inequity, not so much between nations, but within nations, happening across the board. And these socioeconomic changes interact with climate change and the environmental changes, and it's these interactions that can be particularly important. And I think the food price crisis of 2008 or so to 2010 is a nice example of how these different drivers interact. So that food price crisis was an interaction between droughts in key production regions of food, pro-biofuel policies here and in Europe. And so the drought in the key production regions meant that there was less of biofood, price went up, pro-biofuel policies moved agricultural land production away from food production to energy production. That pushed up the price further. And there's some scientists who argue it was further driven by speculation, financial crisis style speculation. People were speculating that the price of food would go up more and actually speculating in a way that it did. So as a result of this, a number of countries around the world, as you can see from that figure, put in place food export restrictions. So India, China, etc. said we're not going to export any more food. That pushed up prices further as it reduced global demand. Now, these sorts of interactive changes have impacts on the world's iconic protected areas. So in low-income countries like Nepal and Ethiopia, food prices may force people to then go and harvest from a protected area because they cannot afford food anymore. In high-income countries such as the United States or Australia, the financial crisis, which as I said, some people argue is not unrelated from the food price crisis, has affected the amount of funding available to protected area agencies and the ability of those agencies to deal with threats. So we're meeting this week to further develop a research project to understand how the world's iconic protected areas can be resilient in the face of global change. In other words, what can policymakers and society do to strengthen the ability of iconic protected areas to cope with and survive global change and still protect the natural attractions that draw tourists from around the world to these protected areas? And then as a result of that, still sustain the communities that live around these protected areas that are dependent on that tourism income. Now I'm briefly going to talk about my work in 2 iconic protected areas just to give you an idea of some of these sorts of issues that we're discussing and are interested in. Australia's Great Barrier Reef. Has anyone in this, other than the people who were there earlier this year, had the opportunity to go out to the Great Barrier Reef? Some of you. So it's a good spot. Get out on a boat like this and see cool little fish and corals. And I did my PhD research on the resilience of the coral reef tourism sector on Australia's Great Barrier Reef to global change. Now, you probably have read quite a lot in the press here and possibly elsewhere about climate change, coral bleaching, ocean acidification, and the impacts on coral reefs. Now, those are important drivers that affect the resilience of that tourism sector and obviously the ecological health of the reef. But interestingly, when I spoke to all the companies running these tours up and down the Great Barrier Reef, they mentioned climate change, but what really hammered them, and what they said is foremost on their mind, is a global financial crisis. Meant that people had pushed up the value of the Australian dollar as an indirect outcome of the financial crisis, and people were traveling to Australia less demand for these businesses, and that was a big issue for them. Now that means that if we're interested in strengthening the resilience of the coral reef tourism system, the coral reefs and the tourism communities dependent on those coral reefs to global change, we're not only interested in, well, what's happening to the corals as a result of climate change, we're interested in things like the financial crisis, which many economists argue started here in the housing sector and then very quickly propagated around the world. Now, another interesting finding I'll just highlight briefly from my PhD research is that the lifestyle values of these reef tourism companies are really important or are importantly associated with their level of resilience. So lifestyle values refer to the extent to which people who start up companies to take tourists out to the reef are doing so because of the natural environment that allows them to live and work in and a natural environment which they enjoy and love. And also, these companies that are motivated by lifestyle values, they're more likely to support reef conservation and more active in reef conservation efforts. So in other words, companies that are motivated by lifestyle values, or the owners and the senior managers of these companies that are motivated by lifestyle values, are both going to be more resilient. The sector will be more resilient. And there's probably going to be more action in terms of reef conservation. So this is good for resilience of the system all around. But now what's interesting is that a lot of the companies on the Great Barrier Reef are actually small companies, 10 employees or so. And they were complaining to me in my discussions with them, well, now one of the things that's really hammering them is this increased red tape they have to deal with. And I'll just mention this briefly. The Australian authorities have recently tried to, or shifted maritime safety legislation from the state level to the federal level. And they've shifted it in a way that the reef tourism companies explained to me now means that a small dive boat is subject to the same regulations as a big cruise ship. And this means they have to go through a costly exercise on an annual basis, go through a lot of paperwork, spend a lot of time and effort on this. Their business might not be that profitable. They're there because they enjoy what they do and they want to be out on the reef, not sitting in the office filling in paperwork. So, and they also argue that, well, these regulations make no sense for either marine safety or for reef conservation or marine conservation in the context of what they're doing. So, in terms of what the Australian society can do to strengthen the resilience of reef tourism, I mean, one of the things is to look, well, what legislation are we putting in place that may be ill-conceived, that's actually something we can control, that's affecting the resilience of the sector. And it's these sorts of broader governance and political issues that we also need to think about as we think about iconic protected areas and global change. Now, Sheila Peake, who will be talking later in this session this afternoon, she'll be talking more about the Great Barrier Reef. So to move briefly on to South Africa's Kruger National Park. Kruger holds many exciting animals like this white rhinoceros, which is actually the global stronghold of the species. For those of you who don't know, that's where the Kruger National Park lies, on the northeastern boundary or the northeastern corner of South Africa, on the border of Zimbabwe and Mozambique. And there's various concerns about how climate change and environmental change may affect biodiversity and animals and the habitats in Kruger. And my colleague Marna Herbst will be talking more about the biodiversity monitoring strategies national parks are following to try and understand these. But the socio-economic drivers, once again, I think as part of global change are really important. This image depicts the communities who live on the western boundary of Kruger. And a lot of them were actually, well, not a lot of them, some of them, a fraction of those communities are there as a result of forced removals from the apartheid era. And so their attitude towards the national park might not be that positive. In addition, these communities are typically low-income communities, and then there's not that much economic activity in these communities themselves. They're dependent on income grants from government or on payments or subsidies from family members who work in Johannesburg. And there's about 3 million people living on the western boundary of Kruger, and some of them, the poorer parts of these communities, that's how they travel. These are low-income communities we're talking about. So now, bringing this back to the food price crisis, and I read in the papers and some journals that there's concern that we're facing another food price crisis coming soon, and actually possibly a bigger one than the one from 2008, and that's partly stemming from the drought that's currently taking place in the United States, which is affecting food production. Now, these families, or these communities who live here, they're dependent on some income, and they've got some of their own crops growing. Now, if food prices increase 2- or 3-fold, that's going to make food unaffordable for these communities. They're not going to be able to buy food anymore. They're going to have to find food from elsewhere. And as I mentioned, there's lots of these communities. Some of them may feel, well, there's a national park just across the fence. We can go in there, we can get food. And a scenario in which food price crises increase to the point where a majority or a lot of these people can no longer afford food and therefore feel that they need to go into the national park as one option to get extra food is not that unrealistic. And this is another scenario or threat under global change that we need to think about. So and that would be a very difficult situation to manage, because national parks it would be really inappropriate in some ways to say, well, you can't come in here and get food because you're starving. But so these are the sorts of concerns, the sorts of issues that are complex and interactive that we're thinking about. And we hope that our research project will help policymakers and society anticipate some of these concerns and threats and think in a structured way through how they may deal with them.